Tap subscribe now. By the end of this video, your mind will be quiet, your body relaxed, and sleep will have arrived. Achaemenid Empire, the largest empire the world had ever seen. How did it work? To understand the sheer magnitude of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, we must first strip away the map of the modern world and reimagine the geography of antiquity. Imagine a single political entity stretching from the burning sands of Libya and the Nile Delta in the west to the snowy passes of the Hindu Kush and the Indus River Valley in the east. Imagine a border that touches the Danube River in Europe and the Aral Sea in Central Asia. At its zenith, around 480 BCE, this empire controlled approximately 44% of the world's entire population. 1 in every 2 human beings on the planet lived under the authority of the great king. It was a superpower on a scale that had never been seen before, dwarfing the Assyrians and Babylonians who preceded it. But numbers and maps tell only a fraction of the story. The true marvel of the Achaemenid Empire was not just its size, but its functionality. It was a complex machine of governance, logistics, economics, and ideology that managed to hold together dozens of distinct ethno-linguistic groups, religions, and cultures for over 2 centuries. How did they do it? How did a semi-nomadic tribe from the Zagros Mountains rise to engineer the first true world empire? To answer this, we must look beyond the Greek histories that have colored our view of Persia for millennia and delve into the administrative tablets, the royal inscriptions, and the archaeological realities of the Persian system. The story begins not with a bang, but with a migration. The Persians were an Indo-Iranian people who arrived on the Iranian plateau around 1000 BCE, settling in the southwestern region known as Fars, or Pars, from which the name Persia is derived. For centuries they were vassals, living in the shadow of the great Mesopotamian powers and their northern cousins, the Medes. The Medes had established a loose confederation that destroyed the Assyrian Empire, but the Persian tribes remained minor players, herding livestock and paying tribute. The turning point came in 559 BCE with the ascension of a local ruler named Cyrus II, later known as Cyrus the Great. Cyrus is one of those rare historical figures whose charisma seems to leap off the ancient clay tablets. He was a military genius, certainly, but his true innovation was political. When he rebelled against his Median grandfather Astyages, he did not merely seek to replace one tyrant with another. He sought to integrate. Upon defeating the Median army, Cyrus spared Astyages and incorporated the Median nobility into his own administration. This created a dual monarchy of sorts, a Medo-Persian confederacy, where the aristocracy of both tribes shared power, commanded armies, and governed provinces. It was the first stroke of the genius that would define the empire, the strategy of co-option rather than annihilation. Cyrus's ambitions did not rest with Media. He turned his eyes westward to the kingdom of Lydia in modern-day Turkey, a realm fabulously wealthy due to the gold dust found in the Pactolus River. The Lydian king, Croesus, famously asked the oracle of Delphi if he should attack Cyrus. The oracle replied that if he crossed the river Halys, a great empire would fall. Croesus crossed, and a great empire did fall, his own. The conquest of Lydia gave the Persians access to the Aegean Sea and the Greek city-states on the coast, bringing 2 very different civilizations into contact. But the greatest prize was Babylon. In 539 BCE, the Neo-Babylonian Empire was the cultural and economic heart of the Near East. Its walls were thought to be impregnable. Cyrus took the city not by storm, but by intelligence and propaganda. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator chosen by Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, to restore order and piety after the reign of the unpopular king Nabonidus. The famous Cyrus cylinder, a clay barrel inscribed with cuneiform, attests to this. It records Cyrus returning displaced peoples to their homelands and restoring their temples. Among these peoples were the Jews, who were allowed to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. This policy of religious tolerance and repatriation was revolutionary. By allowing subject peoples to worship their own gods and follow their own customs, Cyrus ensured their loyalty and reduced the cost of occupation. He recognized that a happy taxpayer is more profitable than a dead rebel. When Cyrus died in battle against the Massagetæ nomads in Central Asia in 530 BCE, the empire was vast but fragile. It fell to his son, Cambyses II, to secure the frontiers. Cambyses is often villainized in Greek sources, particularly by Herodotus, who portrays him as a madman who stabbed the sacred Apis bull of Egypt. However, Egyptian archaeological evidence suggests a different reality. Cambyses conquered Egypt, the last great power in the region, in 525 BCE. He adopted the titles of the pharaohs, paid homage to Egyptian gods, and continued his father's policy of integration. The story of the Mad King was likely later propaganda. His death, however, triggered a crisis of succession that almost tore the empire apart. A figure claiming to be his brother Bardias seized the throne, though official accounts claimed this was an impostor, a magus named Gaumata. Into this chaos stepped a distant relative of the royal family, a spear-bearer named Darius. Darius I, or Darius the Great, is the true architect of the Achaemenid system. If Cyrus was the conqueror, Darius was the administrator. After seizing the throne in 522 BCE and suppressing revolts in 19 provinces in a single year, a feat he proudly proclaimed on the massive Behistun inscription carved into a cliff face, Darius set about reorganizing the empire into a sustainable structure. He realized that personal charisma was not enough to rule a domain that spanned 3 continents. He needed bureaucracy. He divided the empire into 20 administrative provinces known as satrapies. Each satrapy was governed by a satrap, or protector of the kingdom. These men were usually Persian or Median nobles, often relatives of the king, effectively viceroys with immense power. They collected taxes, raised armies, and dispensed justice. However, Darius was wary of creating rivals. To prevent satraps from becoming too independent, he separated military and civil power. The garrison commanders in the citadels reported directly to the king, not the satrap. Furthermore, he instituted a network of royal inspectors, known as the eyes and ears of the king. These officials would travel unexpectedly to the provinces to audit accounts and report on the loyalty of the governors. It was a system of checks and balances designed to project the king's authority thousands of miles from the center. To bind this vast patchwork of territories together, Darius revolutionized the economy. Before the Persians, trade was largely conducted through barter or the exchange of bullion, weighed chunks of silver. Darius introduced a standardized gold coin, the daric, and a silver coin, the siglos. This standardization facilitated trade from India to Greece, creating a common market that boosted the economy of the entire region. Merchants could now travel with currency that was recognized and valued across borders. To support this trade and the movement of armies, the Persians built an incredible infrastructure. The Royal Road, the most famous of these highways, stretched over 1,600 miles from Susa in Elam to Sardis in Anatolia. It was paved, maintained, and policed. Along this road, at intervals of roughly a day's ride, were caravanserais, inns, and relay stations. This brings us to the famous Persian courier system, the Angarium. Mounted couriers could carry a message from Susa to Sardis in 7 days, a journey that took an army 3 months. The Greek historian Herodotus famously wrote of them, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." This communication network was the nervous system of the empire, allowing the great king to react swiftly to threats and manage the affairs of distant lands. The heart of this administration lay in the capitals. The Achaemenids did not have a single capital. They had a mobile court that moved with the seasons to escape the extremes of the Iranian climate. They spent winters in the warm plains of Babylon or Susa, springs in the cool highlands of Ecbatana, and ceremonial occasions in the spiritual center of the empire, Persepolis. Persepolis, or Parsa, began construction under Darius and continued under his successors. It was not a city of administration or commerce, but a ritual complex designed to showcase the unity and diversity of the empire. The bas-reliefs on the Ecbatana, the Great Audience Hall, depict delegations from 23 subject nations bringing gifts to the king. Ethiopians with ivory, Indians with gold dust, Scythians with horses, Greeks with fabrics. These reliefs are crucial because they show the subjects not as crushed slaves, but as dignified participants in the imperial order. The figures are holding hands, walking calmly. It was an idealized image of the Pax Persica, the Persian peace. The construction of Persepolis also reveals the truth about Persian labor. For a long time, it was assumed that such monuments were built by slave labor, much like the pyramids were erroneously thought to be. However, the discovery of the Persepolis fortification archive, tens of thousands of clay tablets found in the fortification walls, changed everything. These tablets are administrative receipts for food rations. They show that the workers at Persepolis were paid. There were stonemasons, carpenters, and laborers from Egypt, Greece, and Babylonia. They received rations of wine, grain, and meat, and cash payments. The tablets even reveal a system of maternity leave and rations for women, with higher rations for those who bore boys, and specialized rations for supervisors. This was a highly bureaucratic, controlled economy, but one that recognized the value of skilled labor. Slavery existed in the empire, as it did everywhere in the ancient world, but the state infrastructure was built largely by paid professionals. Underpinning this entire structure was the ideology of kingship and religion. The Achaemenids were Zoroastrians, followers of the prophet Zoroaster, who taught of a cosmic struggle between Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Wisdom and Truth, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of destruction and lies. The Persian king saw himself as the agent of Ahura Mazda on earth. His duty was to uphold Arda, truth, order, and justice, and to fight against Drauga, the lie, chaos, and rebellion. When Darius crushed a rebellion, he said he destroyed the lie. This religious dualism had profound political implications. It meant that the king was not a god himself, unlike the pharaohs of Egypt, but a divinely appointed guardian. Rebellion was not just a political act, it was a moral failing, a victory for the lie. Yet paradoxically, this strong religious conviction did not lead to persecution. Because Ahura Mazda was the supreme creator, all other gods could be seen as local manifestations of the divine, or simply as lesser entities that belonged to the subject peoples. As long as the subjects paid their tribute and did not rebel, they were free to practice their faith. This tolerance was a pragmatic tool of statecraft. The Persians understood that people fight harder for their gods than for their kings. By appropriating the local priesthoods, the king of Persia was also the pharaoh of Egypt and the king of Babylon. They neutralized the most potent potential source of opposition. However, an empire of this size required more than just tolerance and roads. It required a sword. The Achaemenid military was a reflection of the empire's diversity. The core of the army was the Persians and Medes, who provided the cavalry and the elite infantry. The most famous unit was the 10,000 Immortals, so named because if a man fell, he was immediately replaced, keeping the number constant. They were the king's personal guard and the shock troops of the empire. But the bulk of the army was a levy system. When the king called for war, each satrapy was required to provide a specific contingent of troops equipped in their national dress and weapons. This resulted in a colorful but often logistically nightmare army: Assyrian infantry, Scythian archers, Indian chariots, and Arabian camel cavalry. The logistical feat of feeding and moving such a force was staggering. The Persians became masters of supply lines, digging canals, like the one Xerxes dug through the Mount Athos Peninsula, and building pontoon bridges across the Hellespont to move troops from Asia to Europe. The navy was another area where the Persians showed their adaptability. The Persians themselves were a landlocked people with no maritime tradition. Instead of trying to learn to sail, they simply utilized the maritime subjects of the empire: the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the Cypriots, and the Greeks of Ionia. The Phoenician triremes formed the backbone of the Persian fleet. This reliance on subject peoples for critical military arms was both a strength and a weakness. It allowed Persia to project power across the Mediterranean without a native naval culture. But it also meant that the loyalty of the navy was dependent on the loyalty of the Phoenician and Greek kings who commanded the ships. It is in the context of this massive multi-ethnic military machine that we must view the Greco-Persian Wars. For the Greeks, the wars of 490 and 480 BCE were a clash of civilizations, a fight for survival and freedom. For the Persians, it was a frontier punitive expedition. Athens had supported a rebellion in Ionia, burning the Persian regional capital of Sardis. Darius wanted to punish Athens and secure the western border. The Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE was a surprising defeat, but for the empire, it was a minor setback, a border skirmish gone wrong. When Xerxes I returned in 480 BCE, he brought the full weight of the imperial army. The logistics of this invasion were the real marvel, moving hundreds of thousands of men and animals into a resource-poor peninsula. While the Greeks celebrate the battles of Thermopylae and Salamis, we must remember that the Persians actually accomplished most of their strategic goals. They marched into Greece, defeated the Spartans at the pass eventually, and burned Athens to the ground twice. The defeat at Salamis and later at Plataea marked the end of Persian expansion into Europe, but it did not mark the end of the empire. Persia simply retreated to the Asian coast and switched strategies. Instead of soldiers, they started sending gold. For the next century, Persian gold would decide the outcome of Greek wars more effectively than Persian arrows ever did. They played Athens and Sparta against each other, ensuring that neither became strong enough to threaten the empire. As the empire matured into the reigns of Artaxerxes I and Darius II, the internal dynamics of the court began to change. The harem became a center of political power. The Greek sources love to tell salacious stories of eunuchs and scheming queen mothers, like the formidable Parysatis. While we must filter out the misogyny and Orientalism of these accounts, it is true that access to the king became the primary currency of power. The king became more secluded. separated from his subjects by layers of protocol and ritual. Proskynesis, the act of bowing or blowing a kiss to the king, was mandatory. This seclusion created a disconnect. The king relied on his officials to know the truth of the empire, and officials often had reasons to hide the truth. One of the structural weaknesses that developed over time was the hereditary nature of the satrapies. Originally, satraps were appointed officials. Over generations, these positions became de facto hereditary fiefdoms. Powerful families entrenched themselves in the provinces, commanding private armies and hoarding tax revenue. This led to the phenomenon of satrapal revolts. In the 4th century BCE, the Great Satraps' Revolt saw large swaths of Anatolia rise up against Artaxerxes II. The empire survived because the rebels were disunited and the king still held the treasury and the core Persian regiments, but the cracks were showing. The central authority was weakening, and the periphery was becoming more autonomous. Another fascinating aspect of the later empire was the role of mercenary soldiers. As the Persian nobility became more settled and perhaps less martial, and as the levy system proved cumbersome, the great kings began to rely heavily on Greek mercenaries. The Anabasis of Xenophon tells the story of 10,000 Greek heavy infantry hired by a Persian prince, Cyrus the Younger, to overthrow his brother, King Artaxerxes II. The fact that a claimant to the throne could hire a foreign army to march into the heart of the empire revealed a dangerous reliance on outsourced military power. It also showed the Greeks that the Persian interior was vulnerable. Xenophon and his men marched through the heart of Mesopotamia and fought their way out to the Black Sea, proving that the Persian colossus had feet of clay if you could pierce the outer shell. Despite these political struggles, the Achaemenid economy remained robust. The agricultural base of Mesopotamia and Egypt was incredibly productive. The empire facilitated the exchange of crops and technologies. Rice, for instance, was introduced to Mesopotamia from India during this period. Sesame was cultivated widely. The Quanet system, a method of underground irrigation tunnels developed in Iran, spread throughout the Near East and North Africa, allowing for agriculture in arid regions. This technology is still in use today in parts of the world. The legal system also continued to function smoothly. We have thousands of legal documents from Babylonia during the Persian period dealing with marriage, inheritance, and business contracts. They show a society where the rule of law was respected, and where judges, the distinct class of royal judges, operated with a degree of independence. The king's law was the ultimate authority, overlaying the local traditions. Culturally, the empire was a sponge. The Achaemenids were not dogmatic about imposing their own art styles. Instead, they created a composite imperial style. The columns at Persepolis show Greek influence in the fluting, but are topped with uniquely Persian double-bull capitals. The glazed brickwork of Susa owes much to Babylon. The metalwork, particularly the famous gold rhytons, drinking vessels, shows Scythian and Median influences. This Achaemenid synthesis was a visual representation of the empire's motto, unity in diversity. They took the best craftsmen and the best styles from every corner of the known world and fused them to create something grander. This extended to food, fashion, and language. The administrative language of the empire was not Persian, but Imperial Aramaic, a Semitic language that had been the lingua franca of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. By adopting Aramaic, the Persians ensured that a scribe in Egypt could communicate with a scribe in Bactria. Old Persian was used primarily for royal inscriptions and ceremonial purposes. This pragmatism regarding language is another example of the functional nature of their rule. The daily life of a subject in the empire varied wildly depending on location, but there was a general sense of stability. The Pax Persica meant that for vast regions, the constant raiding and petty warfare of the previous centuries had ceased. A merchant could travel from the Mediterranean to the Indus without crossing a hostile border. This interconnectedness fostered a cosmopolitan worldview. Ideas traveled along with goods. It is likely during this period that Indian philosophical concepts began to filter west, and Greek scientific ideas filtered east. The interactions between the Greeks and Persians were not just violent, they were deeply intellectual. Many Greek thinkers, scientists, and doctors lived and worked at the Persian court. Democedes, a Greek physician, treated Darius I. The cultural exchange was constant and fruitful. However, the late 4th century brought a challenger that the Achaemenid system could not absorb or buy off: Macedon. The rise of Philip II and his son Alexander presented a new kind of threat. The Macedonian army was a professional force, drilled to perfection, combining the heavy phalanx with shock cavalry. When Alexander crossed into Asia in 334 BCE, the Persian Empire was under the rule of Darius III. Darius III has gone down in history as the man who lost the world, often depicted as a coward. But the historical record suggests he was a competent ruler who simply faced a military anomaly. He reacted to Alexander with the standard playbook: let the local satraps handle it. When that failed at the Battle of Granicus, he raised the imperial army. The collapse of the Achaemenid Empire under Alexander's onslaught is a study in how a centralized system can fail when the head is cut off. At the Battle of Issus and later at Gaugamela, Alexander targeted the king directly. The Persian army was vast, but it was hierarchical. All loyalty flowed to the king. When Darius III fled the battlefield, whether out of cowardice or tactical necessity to preserve the leadership, the army dissolved. The structure that held the empire together became its undoing. Without the king, the satraps had no center of gravity. Alexander systematically dismantled the empire, seizing the treasuries at Sardis, Susa, and Persepolis. The capture of Persepolis was the symbolic end. The burning of the Great Palace, whether an act of drunken revenge for the burning of Athens or a calculated political statement, signaled that the Achaemenid era was over. Yet, even in its fall, the empire dictated the terms of the future. Alexander did not destroy the Achaemenid system. He hijacked it. He kept the satrapies. He kept the tax system. He began to dress in Persian robes and demanded proskynesis. He married a Persian princess and encouraged his generals to do the same. He realized what Cyrus had realized 2 centuries earlier. You cannot rule Asia as a conqueror. You must rule it as a king of kings. The Achaemenid administrative framework was so robust that it survived the death of the dynasty. It became the blueprint for the Seleucid Empire, the Parthians, and the Sassanids. Even the Roman Empire adopted aspects of the Persian court ceremonial and bureaucratic organization. The legacy of the Achaemenid Empire is often obscured by the Western focus on Greece. We are taught to view Marathon and Salamis as the victories of freedom over tyranny. But this binary obscures the reality of the Persian achievement. They built the first system of federal governance. They pioneered the concept of religious tolerance as state policy. They created an economic zone that connected the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. They proved that it was possible to govern a multicultural, multilingual population under a single law without enforcing a single culture. One of the most intriguing aspects of the empire's functioning was its legal pluralism. While there was the king's law, local legal traditions were largely left intact. In Egypt, the priests continued to judge according to ancient Egyptian law. In Babylon, the business firms operated under Babylonian contract law. The Persians intervened only when these local laws conflicted with imperial interests or tax collection. This created a layered legal society. A Jewish soldier in the garrison at Elephantine in Egypt could follow Jewish family law, Egyptian property law, and Persian military law all at the same time. This flexibility reduced the friction of foreign rule. It made the Persians seem less like occupiers and more like a distant, overarching canopy under which life could proceed as normal. Let us look closer at the agricultural infrastructure, specifically the qanats. These were not just holes in the ground, they were engineering marvels. To build a qanat, surveyors had to find a water source in an alluvial fan, often miles away from the settlement. They would then dig a mother well. From there, they dug a slightly sloping tunnel to transport the water by gravity to the surface, thousands of meters away. This required advanced knowledge of geology, surveying, and hydraulics. Vertical shafts were dug at intervals for ventilation and removing spoil. The maintenance of these qanats required community cooperation and regulation, fostering a sense of social cohesion. The state encouraged this by granting tax exemptions to those who brought new land under cultivation using irrigation. This policy expanded the arable land of the empire significantly, supporting a growing population and a massive army. The social structure of the empire was also more fluid than often depicted. While there was a strict hierarchy with the king at the top, followed by the great nobles, the bandoza, and then the free people, there was social mobility. We have records of merchants rising to prominence, and even slaves earning their freedom and attaining high positions in business management. The role of women in the Achaemenid period was also surprisingly advanced compared to their Greek contemporaries. Royal women like Atassa and Artistone held vast estates, issued orders, and traveled independently. The fortification tablets show they had their own administration. Even non-royal women were employed as managers of work crews, known as Arash Shara, receiving higher rations than the men they supervised based on their skill level. This suggests a society where competence could override gender roles in the economic sphere. The information war was another arena where the Achaemenids excelled. The Behistun inscription is a prime example. Carved high up on a cliff face on the main road between Mesopotamia and Iran, it was legible only to the gods, but its message was disseminated throughout the empire. Darius sent copies of the text in Aramaic to the provinces. We have found fragments of it in Egypt. The message was clear. Darius is the legitimate king, chosen by Ahura Mazda, and anyone who opposes him is a liar and an agent of chaos. This control of the narrative was essential. The Persians understood the power of the written word and the monumental image. The repetition of the image of the king fighting a lion or a monster on seals, coins, and reliefs reinforced the idea of the king as the protector of the realm. However, the empire was not without its darker sides. The punishments for treason were horrific. The Persians were creative in their cruelty when it came to those who threatened the king. Impalement was a standard punishment for rebels. The scaphism, or the boats, a method of torture described by Plutarch, is likely an exaggeration, but it reflects the terrifying reputation of Persian justice. This terror was a tool. In an empire so vast, where the army could not be everywhere, the fear of the king's wrath served as a deterrent. The king's peace was maintained by the sword as much as by the gold coin. The management of the frontier was another complex task. the empire faced threats from the nomadic tribes of the steppes in the north, the Saka. Instead of just building a wall, the Persians used a mix of fortification, diplomacy, and settlement. They settled loyal populations on the frontiers to act as buffers. They hired the Saka as mercenaries. They engaged in punitive expeditions, like the one Darius launched into Scythia, modern Ukraine. Though often dismissed as a failure because he didn't conquer the Scythians, the campaign demonstrated the reach of the Persian arms and secured the northern border for a generation. As we move toward the end of the Achaemenid timeline, we must consider the internal decay that set in. The sheer accumulation of wealth in the royal treasuries removed gold and silver from circulation, causing deflation and economic stagnation in the provinces. The satraps, feeling the pressure, squeezed the peasantry harder. This economic mismanagement alienated the subjects. When Alexander arrived, many regions, particularly Egypt and Babylon, did not resist fiercely. They were tired of the heavy taxation and the increasing interference of the later Persian kings, who had forgotten the deft touch of Cyrus and Darius. The empire had become a heavy weight rather than a protective canopy. The Achaemenid military evolved too, but perhaps not enough. By the time of Darius III, the scythed chariots were becoming obsolete against disciplined infantry. The wicker shields of the Persian infantry, effective against arrows, were useless against the long sarissa pikes of the Macedonians. The reliance on cavalry was still the Persian doctrine, but they failed to adapt to the combined arms tactics of the West. They were fighting a 5th century war in the 4th century. It is also worth noting the influence of the Achaemenids on the religious landscape of the world. The contact between the Jewish exiles and the Persians in Babylon is a pivotal moment in history. Many scholars argue that biblical concepts such as the duality of good and evil, the figure of a devil, Satan, the idea of a final judgment, and the resurrection of the dead were heavily influenced by Zoroastrianism during this period. The word paradise itself comes from the Old Persian paradisa, referring to the walled gardens of the Persian kings. These gardens were attempts to create a perfect environment, a heaven on earth, reflecting the king's duty to order the world. The fall of the empire was swift, but its shadow was long. When Alexander burned Persepolis, the heat of the fire cracked the stone columns, but it also baked the clay tablets of the archives, preserving them for archaeologists to find thousands of years later. It is a supreme irony that the act of destruction saved the very records that now allow us to reconstruct the truth of the empire. These tablets tell us of the grain distributions, the travel rations, the names of the workers. They allow us to hear the voices of the administrators, not just the speeches of the kings. In the final analysis, the Achaemenid Empire worked because it was flexible. It was a federal system before the concept existed. It balanced the absolute power of the king with the autonomy of the local cultures. It balanced a centralized military with regional levies. It created a world system where a man could be an Egyptian, a subject of the great king, and a worshipper of Ptah all at once. It failed eventually, as all empires do, when the balance tipped. When the center became too greedy, the periphery too independent, and the external pressure too great. But for 200 years, it showed the world that it was possible to rule the many as one. The dream of Cyrus, the order of Darius, and the peace of the Persians laid the foundation for every universal empire that followed. The Roman eagle, the Byzantine double-headed eagle, and the Caliphate all perched on the ruins of Persepolis. The story of the Achaemenids is the story of the first time humanity tried to build a global village. It was imperfect, it was often brutal, but it was undeniably magnificent. To bridge the gap between the dramatic fall of the Achaemenid dynasty and the granular reality of how it actually functioned, we must return to the smoking ruins of Persepolis in 330 BCE. When Alexander the Great's soldiers set the torch to the great palaces, they believed they were erasing the Persian presence from history, wiping the slate clean for a new Hellenistic age. But fire has a peculiar effect on clay. While it destroys parchment and melts gold, it bakes clay into ceramic, making it virtually indestructible. In the 1930s, archaeologists from the University of Chicago, excavating the fortification walls of Persepolis, stumbled upon a discovery that would revolutionize our understanding of the ancient world. They found tens of thousands of clay tablets, hardened by the very fire meant to destroy them. These were not the grand royal inscriptions of Darius or Xerxes, proclaiming their victories and their lineage in 3 languages. These were the receipts. They were the bureaucratic debris of the empire, the daily paperwork of the imperial supply chain. Known today as the Persepolis Fortification Archive and the Persepolis Treasury Archive, these documents allow us to ignore the biased Greek accounts of Herodotus and Xenophon for a moment and look directly into the engine room of the empire. If we want to understand how did it work on a molecular level, we must learn to read the receipts, for they reveal a level of sophistication, control, and complexity that rivals modern corporate logistics. The first thing the Fortification Archive reveals is the obsession with accounting and accountability that permeated the Persian state. Every single transaction, no matter how small, was recorded. If a traveler stopped at a way station and fed his horse 2 quarts of barley, a scribe was there to impress a stylus into wet clay, recording the date, the location, the amount, the name of the traveler, and the official who authorized it. This destroys the image of the Oriental despotism, where the king's word was law and chaos reigned below. Instead, we see a state run by a rigorous, almost paranoid, bureaucracy. The system hinged on a document called the Halmi, or a sealed authorization. We often speak of the royal road and the speed of travel, but the tablets show us that you could not move an inch on this road without a Halmi. It was essentially a visa and a credit card combined, issued by the king or high officials like the mysterious Parnaka, who appears in the texts as the chief administrator of the Persepolis region. The Halmi dictated exactly what rations a traveler was entitled to. We have records of satraps, ambassadors, and even groups of workers carrying these sealed documents. One tablet records a group of workers traveling from India to Susa. Another records a guide leading a party of Cappadocians. The road was a controlled space, a corridor of state power where every calorie consumed was tracked by the central administration. This tracking of calories brings us to the actual currency of the empire. While Darius introduced gold and silver coinage, the internal economy of the state, particularly regarding the payment of workers and officials, was largely non-monetary. It was a ration system, but calling it that simplifies it too much. It was a complex system of redistribution. The tablets distinguish between different grades of workers, known as kurtash. These were not slaves in the chattel sense of the American South, nor were they free citizens in the Greek sense. They were dependent laborers, bound to the state institutions. The detailed ledgers show us their diet and, by extension, their standard of living. The baseline ration was barley and wine or beer. But it wasn't uniform. Specialized workers, stonemasons, relief carvers, makers of inlay, received significantly more. They also received meat rations, a luxury in the ancient world. We see receipts for sheep and goats being distributed to work crews. This suggests that the Achaemenid state understood the concept of nutritional incentives. To get the high-quality art of Persepolis, you had to keep your artisans well-fed and content. The bureaucracy was so specific that we find records of travel rations versus staying rations, and even adjustments made for sickness or special festivals. One of the most startling revelations from the fortification archive concerns the status of women, a topic on which Greek sources are notoriously unreliable and sensationalist. The Greeks depicted Persian women as secluded, manipulative, and entirely dependent on men, hidden away in the harem. The Elamite tablets tell a radically different story. We find women, referred to as pashap, heading their own work crews. These were not just domestic servants. They were supervisors in the textile workshops and grain processing centers. The ration lists show that these female supervisors often received higher payments than the men working under them, based purely on their rank and skill. This is a meritocratic detail that contradicts the patriarchal narrative we might expect. Furthermore, the highest-ranking women, the royal wives and mothers, were economic powerhouses in their own right. The tablets reveal that women like Erdabama, a powerful noblewoman, possibly the mother of Darius or a senior wife, held vast estates. She had her own administration, her own seal, and her own officials. She issued orders for the movement of grain and wine and the deployment of labor forces. She was not a passive figure behind a curtain. She was a major stakeholder in the imperial economy, managing resources that rivaled those of a satrap. The archives also provide a fascinating glimpse into the social welfare policies of the empire, specifically regarding maternity. The state provided special rations for new mothers. These payments were not trivial. A woman who gave birth received a bonus in wine and grain. Interestingly, and perhaps creating a slight dent in our modern praise for their equality, the bonus for a male child was twice that for a female child. However, the very existence of state-sponsored maternity leave and nutritional support for mothers was a revolutionary concept in the 5th century BCE. It demonstrates that the state viewed the population as a resource to be nurtured. The health of the Kratash class was a matter of state security. A healthy population meant a steady supply of labor for the construction projects and soldiers for the armies. This pragmatic humanism is a recurring theme in the administrative texts. The empire cared for its subjects not necessarily out of kindness, but out of an understanding of the economics of empire. Let us zoom out from the workers to the elite, to the table of the great king himself. The Greek writers were obsessed with the king's dinner, describing it as a spectacle of gluttony and excess. They claim the king fed 15,000 people a day. For a long time, historians dismissed this as exaggeration. However, the ration lists from Persepolis suggest the Greeks might have been underestimating. The king's table was not just a dinner party, it was an economic institution. The king was the ultimate redistributor. All the produce of the empire, the best dates from Babylon, the finest wine from Syria, the wheat from Egypt, the livestock from Media, flowed to the center. The king then redistributed this surplus to his courtiers, his guards, his officials, and his workers. To eat from the king's table was to be incorporated into the body of the empire. The tablets record massive outlays of poultry, game birds, sheep, and flour for the royal storehouse. This suggests that the court was a moving city, a mobile capital that consumed the resources of the province it occupied, but also stimulated the local economy by creating a massive demand for goods. The luxury was political. The famous gold rhytons, horn-shaped drinking vessels ending in the head of a griffin or a lion, were not just pretty objects. They were diplomatic gifts. When the king gave a courtier a gold rhyton, he was binding that man to him with a tangible symbol of imperial wealth. The flow of luxury goods was the adhesive that held the nobility together. The administration of this luxury required a specific class of officials, and the tablets introduce us to the ganzabara, or the treasurers. These men were the gatekeepers of the empire's wealth. They were responsible for the raw materials, the gold dust, the silver bullion, the lapis lazuli. The fortification archive shows us that the separation between the state treasury and the religious treasury was porous. This brings us to the complex religious life of the empire. While the kings were Zoroastrians, the administration supported a multicultural pantheon. We find the state issuing rations for the land sacrifice, a standard religious offering. But we also find rations issued for the worship of Elamite gods like Humban and Simit, and even Babylonian deities. The Magi appear in the texts not just as priests but as administrators of these sacrifices. They are the ones receiving the grain and wine to perform the rituals that keep the cosmic order intact. This confirms that the Achaemenid religious policy was not just tolerance in the modern passive sense, it was active sponsorship. The state paid for the sacrifices of the subject peoples, gods, because the king needed the favor of all the gods, not just his own. If Humban was angry, it was bad for the harvest in Elam, and a bad harvest in Elam was bad for the king's tax revenue. Therefore, the king fed Humban. This pragmatic integration extended to the management of the environment itself. One of the most Persian of all concepts is the Paradisa, the walled garden or hunting park, from which we get the word paradise. These were not merely ornamental flower gardens. They were vast, enclosed, ecological reserves. The tablets and later archaeology show that the Persians were obsessed with arboriculture. They transplanted trees from one end of the empire to the other, testing which species would thrive in different climates. They brought fruit trees to the Iranian plateau and took pistachios to Aleppo. The Paradisa was a microcosm of the empire's fertility, brought under the orderly control of the king. It was also a political theater. When the king hunted lions in these parks, it was a ritual display of his power over the forces of chaos, the wild beasts. But more importantly, the administration of these parks required water. The qanat system mentioned earlier was managed by the state. The tablets refer to water officials who monitored the flow and distribution of water in the arid heartland. Water was a commodity as monitored as grain. The genius of the Persian system was that it turned the management of scarce resources, water and arable land, into a mechanism of loyalty. If you wanted water for your crops, you needed to be in good standing with the local satrap. The satraps themselves, the protectors of the kingdom, deserve a closer look through the lens of the archives. We often imagine them as independent kings, but the texts reveal they were tightly tethered to the center by the bureaucracy. A satrap like Parnika, Darius's uncle, had a huge staff of scribes who documented his every move. He could not simply appropriate grain for his own use. He had to issue a draft on the royal stores, which was recorded. However, the satrapal courts were designed to be fractals of the royal court. In Sardis or Memphis or Bactra, the satrap held court in a palace that mimicked Persepolis. He had his own king's table, his own paradisa, and his own bureaucratic corps. This was intentional. It meant that a local noble in Anatolia didn't have to travel 500 miles to Susa to see what imperial power looked like. He saw it in the satrap's palace in Sardis. This decentralized display of power was crucial for holding the periphery. The satrap was the interface. He wore Persian robes, practiced Persian etiquette, and likely spoke Aramaic and Old Persian, but he also had to navigate the local politics. The success of the empire depended on these men being Persian enough to be loyal to the king, but adaptable enough to be accepted by the locals. One of the most specific and interesting aspects of the military logistics, found in the details of the empire, is the horse breeding program. The Persian army relied on cavalry, and cavalry requires horses, thousands of them. The tablets speak of vast horse herds maintained by the state. These were not just random grazing lands. They were stud farms managed with genetic precision. The Nicaean horse, a breed famous in antiquity for its size and strength, likely the ancestor of the modern destrier, was a state secret. The administration tracked the bloodlines and the distribution of these horses. We see receipts for grain explicitly marked for the horses of the king. The loss of these breeding grounds in Media during the later wars with Alexander was a catastrophic blow to the Persian military capacity. It wasn't just that they lost soldiers, they lost the industrial base that produced their tanks, the heavy cavalry horses. Let us also delve into the eyes and ears of the king, the intelligence network. While the Greeks saw this as a spy network, the internal evidence suggests it was more like an inspectorate general. These officials were auditors. They showed up at the storehouses in the provinces and checked the clay tablets against the physical inventory. They ensured that the grain the satrap claimed was actually there. Corruption was the eternal enemy of the empire. In a system so vast, the temptation for a local official to skim 10% of the tax revenue was immense. The ears were the mechanism to keep this check. They reported directly to the king, bypassing the satrap. This created a dual chain of command that is a hallmark of resilient authoritarian systems. The military commander answered to the king, the satrap answered to the king, and the auditor answered to the king. None of them answered to each other, preventing any single official from consolidating enough power to break away, until the system began to rot from the head down in the 4th century. Another fascinating detail is the standardization of measures. To run an economy from the Indus to the Nile, you need to agree on what a liter is. The Achaemenids introduced the artaba, a measure of volume for grain. While local measures persisted, the imperial tax was calculated in artabas. This forced the local economies to convert their thinking into imperial terms. It's similar to how the US dollar functions today as a global baseline. A merchant in Babylon might sell barley in local bushels, but he paid his taxes in artabas. This forced a cognitive integration of the empire. Every time a merchant calculated his taxes, he was participating in the imperial project. The royal cubit became the standard for construction. The very bricks of the empire were standardized. This is why Achaemenid architecture looks so consistent, whether you are in the Caucasus or in Fars. The archives also shed light on the multi-ethnic nature of the technical class. We find tablets recording, quote, Egyptian woodworkers, Ionian stonemasons, and Babylonian bricklayers working side by side at Persepolis. This was not a melting pot where everyone became Persian. It was a salad bowl where distinct identities were preserved but directed toward a common goal. The rations were sometimes distributed by ethnic group, suggesting they lived in their own quarters. This implies that Persepolis was a city of neighborhoods, a cosmopolitan hub where you would hear a dozen languages in the market. The transfer of technology was immense. The stonemasonry techniques used at Persepolis show clear Greek influence in the toothed chisels used, but the design is Persian. This implies that Greek master craftsmen were teaching Persian apprentices, or vice versa. The empire was a machine for knowledge transfer. We must also consider the role of the scribe in this society. The tupsharu, tablet writers, were the invisible glue of the empire. They were trained in the difficult art of cuneiform and the Aramaic alphabet. They were likely multilingual. In a world of illiteracy, the scribe held immense power. He was the witness, the notary, and the recorder. The consistency of the archives suggests a rigorous training school for scribes. They used the same formulas, the same layout, the same terminology across generations. This intellectual continuity is what allowed the government to function despite the political upheavals at the top. A coup might happen in the palace, a king might be assassinated, but the scribe at the storehouse kept recording the sheep. The bureaucracy had an inertia of its own that provided stability. Finally, looking at the end of the world through the eyes of the administration provides a chilling perspective. The archives abruptly stop. The last tablets date to the arrival of Alexander. We can almost see the moment the pen was dropped. The cease in record-keeping is the true marker of the empire's death. When the scribe stopped writing, the state ceased to exist. It wasn't the death of Darius III that killed the empire. It was the breakdown of the Halmi system, the looting of the granaries, and the dispersal of the Kurtash. The machine stopped because its fuel, the regulated flow of resources, was cut off. Alexander's looters didn't just steal gold, they broke the supply chain. The tragedy of the Achaemenid fall is not just the burning of a palace, but the dismantling of a 2-century-old system that had managed to feed, house, and organize millions of people across 3 continents. The deeper we look into the tablets, the more we realize that the Persian Empire was not merely a military occupation. It was a vast corporate entity, a conglomerate of kingdom holdings. It managed labor relations, invested in agricultural R&D, maintained a continental highway system, and balanced a complex portfolio of religious and cultural interests. It was a state that understood that while armies take territory, only bureaucracy holds it. The Halmi, the Artaba, and the Kurtash are not as romantic as the Immortals or the Golden Rhytons, but they are the true reason the Achaemenid Empire was the largest the world had ever seen. They built a system that was, in many ways, too big to fail, until a young man from Macedon decided to break it into pieces to see how it worked, only to realize he couldn't put it back together again. The silence of the tablets after 330 BCE is the loudest sound in Achaemenid history. It is the sound of the world's first superpower going offline.